seriously popular.
Hello and welcome to Apocalypse Now, dispatches from a world on the brink. In this week's episode, we speak to Edward Alden, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of Failure to Adjust, How Americans Got Left Behind in the Global Economy, and Professor Steve Tsang, director of the China Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies and author of The Political Thought of Xi Jinping. Hello and welcome to Apocalypse Now, dispatches from a world on the brink, the Daily Mail's weekly global news podcast. I'm David Patrikarakos, and I've spent the last 15 years covering foreign affairs and conflict in some of the world's most dangerous places. But even I have to ask, are we now staring at financial ruin?
Donald Trump has done more than any living human being in making China great again.
So I don't think any of this was intended. This is an accidental and potentially quite devastating trade war.
The trade war with China is going to have very substantial and adverse impact, I think, on both sides, unless they pull back.
Tesla stock's been going on for a long time because Musk refuses to run the company. He's wielding chainsaws in Washington, D.C. instead.
I think what we have seen is Trump behaving like a schoolyard bully.
Trump can change his mind on a dime. So this could end before this podcast goes to air.
In this week's episode, President Trump has hastened an international showdown that could define his presidency: conflict with China. His 104% tariff on Chinese goods into the US amounts to economic shock and awe. Speaking in Washington at a Republican Party event this week, hours before his tariffs came into force, Trump told the laughing audience, "I'm telling you, these countries are calling us up, kissing my ass." China, though, not so much. Though they have yet to respond to the latest, eye-watering 104% tariff, Lin Jian, a Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, said, and I quote, "If the US disregards the interests of the two countries and international community and insists on waging a tariff and a trade war, China's response will continue to the end." Meanwhile, the rest of the world looks on aghast as Trump's escalating trade war has plunged global financial markets into the steepest rout since the spread of the COVID pandemic 5 years ago. Drawing parallels with the 1929 Wall Street crash and the ensuing 1930s Great Depression, the US president's tariff plan has led to warnings of a global recession. Closer to home, the Bank of England has assessed that Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs have put global growth at risk, heaping pressure on government treasuries and increasing the likelihood of severe shocks to the financial system. But let's not forget, the US and China had one of the world's most important and complex bilateral relationships. Since 1949, the countries have experienced periods of both tension and cooperation over issues including trade, climate change, and Taiwan. So is this latest trade war destined to change the path both countries are on, or is it yet more brinkmanship and simple dick swinging? And what does Trump's 90-day tariff pause mean for the markets now? PIMCO, one of the world's largest bomb traders, has warned that the US economy still risks sliding into recession despite this sudden reprieve. In a moment, we'll speak to Professor Steve Tsang, director of the China Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies. But first, let's look at the American perspective with Edward Alden, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and author of Failure to Adjust, How Americans Got Left Behind in the Global Economy. Edward, let's start with the 90-day pause on tariff that has excluded China. Won't that only harden Beijing's resolve to push back?
Oh, yes, I think absolutely. I mean, the United States has picked a big fight that I don't think it ever really intended to pick. In the first term, the Trump administration targeted China in some reasonably precise ways, came away with a deal that at the end of the day didn't do all that much, but kept relations between the two countries on an even keel. This has really thrown the US-China relationship into a crisis.
Trump has been obsessed with China since even before he had a political career. Now, there is an argument that this goes back to a desire to get even with China because he thinks it stiffed the US, and it all stems from it being allowed to join the World Trade Organization in 2001, which hollowed out American manufacturing. Is there any truth to this?
There's some truth to it, but I don't think that's the way Trump sees it. I think he has blundered unintentionally into this trade war with China. I mean, if you listen to his rhetoric and you look at his actions, standing alone there in the Rose Garden, I might add, his actions when he imposed the reciprocal tariffs, he thinks the whole world's been cheating the United States on trade and cheating the United States for years. His original obsession going back 40, 45 years was Japan. Japan's cheating the United States on trade and we're paying to defend them. And this is outrageous. And he's held that grudge for 45 years. If you look at China, he actually treated Xi Jinping extremely respectfully in the first term. And the two of them had been talking about a state visit to Washington before this blew up. So I think this was more of a fit of pique when Trump announced the reciprocal tariffs. He warned, if anyone hits back, we'll double the tariffs. And the Chinese don't like being pushed around, and they hit back. And so Trump hit back even harder. So I don't think any of this was intended. This is an accidental and potentially quite devastating trade war that's now focused largely on China.
It seems as if this is a man with a long-standing grievance about America being quote unquote stiffed, who finds different culprits for this. So we're talking about a deep-seated impulse. Now, is this because he is this New York businessman that he can only see things in a zero-sum way? Where does this stem from?
I have tried, and I think some others have too, to figure that out. And nobody's come up with a really good answer. I did a long article for Politico in the first term that was called "The Roots of Trump's Trade Rage." And I was able to trace it back pretty precisely to his anger with the Japanese. I mean, still has two loves. One is real estate, the other is golf. And if you go back to the 1980s, the Japanese bought Rockefeller Center, which is, a prime storied piece of New York real estate. And they bought the Pebble Beach Golf Course, which is probably the greatest golf course in the United States. And I think this infuriated Trump. But nobody else has ever been able to figure out where this particular story about the rest of the world screwing us on trade. He's particularly angry at allies, has been for a long time. They're screwing us on trade and we're paying to protect them. He took out a full-page ad in the mid-1980s in the Boston Globe, the New York Times, the Washington Post to make this case, particularly again targeted at Japan, that our allies are screwing us on trade. But I don't quite honestly, and it frustrates the heck out of me, know exactly how he came to this worldview. All I know is he's held it for a very long time.
Well, as you say, he's even whimsically launched this trade war, but it can be pretty dangerous, no, Edward? I mean, China has some pretty powerful economic weapons of its own, not least the ability to decimate some of the biggest names in US computing. Apple, Intel, Tesla, all of which rely on China for a huge part of their business. Do you envisage these sorts of things coming into play over the next few weeks or even months?
I don't know. As your listeners will know well, the US president is a very hard man to predict, right? His announcement on the broad reciprocal tariffs, he was obviously personally wedded to, cared about it very deeply, held to his conviction for several days as the markets were dissolving. I think it was only the threat of a financial meltdown as opposed to just market losses that finally forced him to change course. But when he did change course, of course, he claimed victory, right? Countries are coming cap in hand. They want to negotiate with us, want to give us great deals. So I would not rule out the possibility that he'll find some way to change the story on China and back down on this. But if we are locked into numbers of this magnitude, this essentially blocks all trade between the US and China. And you point out quite accurately that the Chinese have many tools beyond tariffs. They have a variety of ways to kneecap American corporate interests in China, Apple and Tesla being two good examples. And we've seen, Tesla stock's been going down for a long time because Musk refuses to run the company. He's wielding chainsaws in Washington, D.C. instead. But Apple's stock has really seen a decline specifically associated with the tariffs on China. So, yeah, I don't think the United States has any idea what it's gotten itself into. I don't think the United States wants to go blow for blow with China, but that's where we stand at the moment.
It's a frightening prospect. And I think you point out one important thing, which is Trump, in the end, will help sell any deal. Even if it's a bad one, for him to save face, he'll sell it.
Yeah, I think he could walk away from this. And I think it's one reason the markets are a little more optimistic than I think is warranted given the status quo, because the damage to U.S.-China trade is going to be basically total if these tariffs remain in place. But investors have a long history of watching Trump talk big and climb down. And he did it on the across-the-board tariffs, and I think it's certainly possible he could do it on the China tariffs.
Okay, so here we have two superpowers, irretrievably opposed, it seems, culturally, psychologically, politically, both led by very headstrong leaders with despotic tendencies, albeit one operating within a despotic state, the other not. Now, they get along begrudgingly, but is this moment in history as much about the struggle, their struggle for world dominance, as it is about actually finance?
I mean, the answer is yes. The United States had a theory about China a quarter century ago when it welcomed China into the World Trade Organization, and that was that trade with China would make China more like us, that it would gradually liberalize, if not become democratic, at least become somewhat more open with a slightly larger, more vibrant civil society. That seemed to more or less play out for about a decade since Xi Jinping took over as Chinese leader. It's moved very much in the other direction. So the two countries now, I think, clearly see themselves as both geoeconomic and geostrategic rivals. We know from history that that creates problems when you have countries trying to figure out what their relative position is in terms of world power, and that's where the Chinese and the Americans are. That said, I don't think either actually wants a head-on conflict. I think the costs would be enormous for both the Chinese and the United States. I don't think the Chinese are courting this particularly. But again, we know from history, you go back to your first great world war in Europe, countries blunder into wars, right? You have, balances of power, you have political and strategic rivalries, and countries sometimes do stupid things and end up in conflicts they don't want. And that's what worries me about this situation. I don't think either China or the United States wants any sort of military conflict, but this sort of economic warfare lead to dangerous places for sure.
Trump blames, let's not forget, China for unleashing COVID, which you might think he objects to because of the mass casualties it caused around the world, but more locally because he blames it for wrecking his chances of re-election in 2020, while at the same time highlighting America's reliance on China for pharmaceuticals and other critical supply chains. He's got quite the axe to grind, and on COVID, a lot of people around him do as well. Do you think that it could be not just Trump, but some of those around him pushing him toward greater conflict with China?
I think it's possible. I mean, we get into this, and it's really difficult for people like me who try to analyze these things for a living, because we could talk about the interests at stake. And I think the United States, somewhat under President Obama, quite a bit more under President Trump, quite a bit more still under President Biden, has tried to decouple from China, be less dependent on China for critical materials. COVID was a big part of that story, and I should plug my new book that'll be available in the UK soon on the COVID border closures, called When the World Closed Its Doors. But, during COVID, the United States was made extremely aware of the danger of relying on China for certain critical inputs. So that's been a trend in US policy going back a decade now. But on top of that, you certainly have people in the administration. I don't see Trump himself as personally hostile to Xi Jinping. He respects strongman leaders. And I think he quite likes President Xi, respects President Xi. But there certainly are people in his administration, Peter Navarro, his trade advisor most notably, who have extremely hawkish, dark views about China, and I think see conflict as inevitable. So there are people in his administration, I think, that are pushing in that direction. At the end of the day, if I had to make a judgment here, I think very much President Trump does not want war with China. Trump's made it clear Trump doesn't like war. He avoided the Vietnam War, and I think has made it very clear he wants to keep the United States out of wars. He's been very critical of both Obama's handling of the conflict in Afghanistan, of Biden's handling of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I don't see Trump trying to do things that lead us into conflict with China. But again, intentions aren't always what lead to outcomes. Sometimes these things happen in unexpected ways, as we've seen with this trade war. I think if you had asked President Trump 2 weeks ago, do you want to see the U.S. impose 125% tariffs on China? He would have said, no, that's ridiculous. I have no intention of doing that. And yet that's where we are, right?
For all of the negativity and criticism raining down on Trump, let's not forget in 1979, former chair of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, drove up interest rates to a remarkable 17% in a bid to tackle inflation. It was a terrible mess until it stopped being a terrible mess. And he becomes something of a financial folk hero a few years later. There are people arguing that Trump's chutzpah here could turn the US economy around. And I know personally that Trump and those around him are really worried about the size of the US deficit. They're looking for ways, hence the resources, Greenland, Canada. Is there a chance that his brinkmanship here, his to many dick swinging, could actually end up being to the benefit of the United States?
Well, to argue that, you have to buy the argument that the United States is in a desperate economic situation. And I think your listeners in the UK and those in Europe would take issue with that. I think coming out of COVID, the United States has done better than any other economy in the world. The American companies you mentioned, the tech giants, are the envy of the world. I mean, Britain's economy in comparison has been limping along. You have far bigger structural challenges there than we do here in the United States. If you look at the situation with both the fiscal deficit and the trade deficit, potentially there are issues. I mean, the fiscal deficit in the United States is running a very large government budget deficit. The way you solve that largely is with some combination of tax increases and government spending reductions. The Trump administration is working in its usual chaotic way on government spending reductions, but wants to cut taxes. So it's probably going to worsen the budget deficit. So they're not on a path to solving that problem. And it's not clear that what they're doing here solves the trade deficit problem either. The United States has largely run trade deficits for the last half century. You can tweak those at the margins. There's certainly an argument that the United States needs to bolster advanced manufacturing, particularly in defense critical areas. You saw some of that in Trump's first term. Again, you saw more of it in the Biden administration. But the notion that the United States is on some economic precipice, the way arguably the American economy was in the 1970s, when inflation was crushing the economy and desperate measures were needed. I just don't buy that analysis, and I don't think any serious observers buy that analysis. So this is a crisis that the administration has made up and come up with a set of responses that are making it worse. I mean, in fact, we were closer to the cliff a day and a half ago than we've ever been. I mean, I think this administration came very close to triggering a second financial crisis through its actions. So I just don't see any cleverness in the way that they're approaching these issues.
So where does it come from, Edward? This, I wouldn't say fear, but this obsession with the deficit, because I speak to people in that world and they're obsessed with it.
Again, and it's not just Trump in this case. Some of these views, I think, are fairly unique to the president, but he has a lot of people around him who believe this, who believe that the trade deficit is kind of a direct outflow of resources from the United States to other countries. But, you'd have to get a smarter economist than I am to explain this in any sophisticated way. But it's essentially circular, right? We buy the goods from other countries and they invest in assets in the United States. Sometimes it's tangible assets. Very often it's our treasury bonds. But the fact that they're buying our treasury bills has tended to keep interest rates quite low in the United States, which means our businesses can buy to invest in new assets, which they have been doing. And consumers, people like me, can borrow at generally low cost to buy houses or cars. So I see this largely as a virtuous relationship. I mean, to the extent that it hollows out vital segments of American manufacturing, there's a cause for genuine concern. I think there are reasons not to want the United States to be utterly dependent on high-end semiconductors from a country as vulnerable as Taiwan. I think we need to have our own semiconductor, at least at the top level, semiconductor manufacturing capability. There's certainly other products where you would say the United States is in something of a hole in terms of its manufacturing capacity, and you want to fill that hole. But to claim that the trade deficit, just because it's a big number, is hurting the economy, I think is just economically illiterate.
It's always hard to predict Donald Trump, as you say, but in your opinion, can this end soon? Or are we in a war of attrition that seems likely to escalate?
Trump can change his mind on a dime. So this could end before this podcast goes to air. He could change course. But you pointed this out in one of your questions. There is a larger structural conflict here between the United States and China. What we've seen is a very sudden and dramatic escalation in that conflict. But I do think this one's a little harder to walk away from. There was very little support in the Congress, no support in the business community at all for a trade war with Canada or Mexico or the European Union or Japan. But there is a fair bit of support in the American establishment for tougher measures towards China. There's a lot of worry about the rise of China, about China's influence. So I think this one is a little harder to turn off than the trade conflicts with other countries, unfortunately.
Edward, thank you very much. I look forward to reading your book, and I advise everyone listening to do the same.
Thanks very much, David. Great to be with you.
When we come back, we'll head east to get the thoughts of Professor Steve Tsang, director of the China Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and author of The Political Thought of Xi Jinping. Welcome back to Apocalypse Now, dispatches from a world on the brink. While President Trump has been making waves with his ever-escalating trade war and, according to him, has seen countries fall into line to make a deal with the US, China has stood firm with retaliatory tariff hikes and a promise to stay in this fiscal struggle until the bitter end. Joining me now is Professor Steve Tsang, director of the China Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies and author of The Political Thought of Xi Jinping. Steve, let's start with the 90-day pause on tariffs. What do you think prompted this? Was it just pressure from domestic and international bond markets?
Well, why is Trump pulling back? I think the responses in the markets and in terms of domestic politics probably really make it necessary for him to pull back. He is a smart political operator, whatever you think about him otherwise. And if he keep on trashing the US economy, then he is going to face a very, very significant backlash.
We just mentioned the Wall Street crash and Great Depression. How bad in real terms is this trade war or a coming trade war with China likely to be for the US?
Well, the trade war with China is going to have very substantial and adverse impact, I think, on both sides, unless they pull back. Because the direction of travel is that we're talking about a hard trade or economic decoupling. And the two economies have been very complementary, and both are very heavily dependent on the other for critical supplies of different types. And if we are ending up in a hard decoupling, then the global supply chain between the US and China will be broken. Critical minerals and other things that the United States industries will need may not get provided by China, and some of the high-tech items that China needs for its own economy will also not be delivered to China. So the significance, I think, will be very, very severe. And alternatives countries providing them, I don't think is going to be anywhere near enough to compensate for that disruption.
If we are indeed entering a Cold War with China, how do you fight a Cold War against someone that you are so economically independent with? After all, during the last Cold War with the Soviet Union, there was really no mutual overlapping economic interests with Moscow.
I don't think the Cold War paradigm really works, partly because of what you have just said. The Cold War that we had happened in a very specific context at the end of the Second World War. And with practically no meaningful economic links between the two economies, it was something that could be done easily. You can't do that. And in fact, what we are seeing unfolding at the moment is something much more serious than the Cold War of the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s. We are looking at an active trade war. Both countries harming the other's economy in order to force the other side to submit. Now, that is not a Cold War paradigm. It's much more challenging, much more serious.
Do you think that type of active trade war is more likely to spill over into the type of mass active conflict that we actually avoided during the Cold War?
There is always a risk when you are dealing with two very, very powerful countries which are not governed by institutions and very strongly vested interests, but by two individual leaders who saw that they have the truth and the right on their side, and with very few advisors able to give them frank and open assessments of the reality. So the risk cannot be eliminated. Having said that, I think the actual risk of a hot war between China and the United States is still very, very slight. The United States, for all Donald Trump's talk of imperialism, does not have the capacity to invade China. And it has been clear from the end of the Second World War that the United States had no intention of invading China. So that hasn't actually changed. On the part of Xi Jinping, his first and foremost priority is to stay in power and keep the Communist Party in power. Going to war with the United States put that at risk. If he doesn't win, the party could lose power, and in particular, he himself could lose power. So I don't see either the United States or Xi Jinping wanting to get into a hot war situation, not at least in the foreseeable future.
As someone who is, I guess, in a sense of both America and China, how do you feel that this affects the standing of both countries in the world? And how do you feel about this on a human level?
On a human level, both sides will pay huge economic prices for it. But the Americans have been spectacularly effective in undermining everything positive that the United States represents since the end of the Second World War. The United States is effectively upending the liberal international order put in place at the end of the Second World War, out of which the United States benefited more than any other country because it is the leader of the liberal international order. Now, from China's perspective, Xi Jinping has been working in line with his own global strategy to undermine the liberal international order in order to capture it from within and turn it into something which is either Sino-centric or China-friendly. And Donald Trump's upending the liberal international order is the single most effective step that can be taken and has been taken to further the long-term objective Xi Jinping has with the international order. And so the economic cost of the trade war or the tariff war is something that at the moment would look from Beijing's perspective as bad, but not so bad, because the overall outcome is much more beneficial to China than it can be to the United States.
What you're saying there is that Donald Trump is doing China's work for it. He is overturning the Western-led liberal order so that China doesn't have to, if there is indeed a new war or a new conflict.
I think you put your finger on it. Donald Trump would like to make America great again. Xi Jinping would like to make China great again. Neither has been particularly successful in their own accord. And Donald Trump has done more than any living human being in making China great again.
And what about the long and short term impact on the respective economies, on the Chinese and the American economies of all of this?
I think the short-term impact on the US and Chinese economies are going to be very, very severe. We are going to be talking about, in a few months' time, either substantial price rises in the United States or the non-availability of some consumer items that the great American public expect and have been used to. They simply become either unaffordable or unavailable. And that's going to have a significant impact. It also means that potentially some US industries will get into trouble because they simply cannot get the raw material or components from China at a price or arrangement that is financially viable. The Chinese economy is going to be suffering hugely as well. Factories may well go bankrupt. I mean, I think it's a question of how many of them rather than whether they will. They will try to find alternative markets for Chinese manufactured products. But that's going to be very, very difficult because I think even with only 10% general tariff applicable to the rest of the world is going to be feeling less well off as a result of the new 10% US tariff. And other countries will be also very concerned about Chinese dumping. So they are not going to be able to export products manufactured for the United States to Europe or Japan or Korea or Australasia. They may be able to export some of them to ASEAN countries and some other parts of the global south, which were not as high priorities previously. But that's going to be a very limited alternative market for the excessive manufacturing of products for the United States. Replacing them with domestic consumption? Good luck with that. Easy to talk about it. China has been trying very hard to stimulate domestic consumption for over a decade. That didn't go very far. And with the economy slowing down and the prospect of tomorrow being so much dimmer than for today, you expect Chinese to start splashing out and buying goods that were earmarked for America? God help you.
You paint a very bleak picture there, but Trump is currently doubling down on tariffs, especially with China. If a deal can be reached, can we get back to some sense of normalcy, or are we beyond that? Is the world changed forever now?
Well, what we are seeing at the moment is Donald Trump and Xi Jinping playing a game of chicken. It is not impossible that at some point they agree that let's find a way out. Let's arrange to meet and talk about it, and then we can find a face-saving way out for both sides because the consequences are just too severe for one side in both cases. Now, Trump and Xi do have a good personal relationship, better from the Trump side than from Xi Jinping's side. I don't think Xi Jinping has the kind of respect and admiration for Donald Trump that Donald Trump does have for Xi Jinping. But Xi Jinping is a very pragmatic politician. He will do deals if he can get away with it. The question is the presentation, how it can be presented as neither one of them having bowed to the other. So it will not be realistic for it to happen, for a summit between the two to happen, either in Washington or in Beijing. Donald Trump won't fly to Beijing for that because the visuals is just not so good for him. He will want Xi Jinping to go to Washington appearing as if he were coming to Washington with a begging bowl, which Xi Jinping will not do. So it's a question of whether they can find a neutral ground to meet up and found a way out. But they will really have to, both sides feeling that if they don't do so, the economic fallout will be severe enough for them to be affected personally.
We've seen Trump this week telling fellow Republicans that countries are, and I quote, kissing his ass to do a deal. It's a strange message to send the world. Are we looking at Trump, a world leader, a boorish businessman, or a little of both?
I think what we have seen is Trump behaving like a schoolyard bully. Using that kind of language really is not very helpful. It's not helpful to friends and allies. It's not very helpful to adversaries and competitors or enemies either. And in fact, if he were able to demonstrate how raw American power can get other foreign countries to behave like supplicants, he himself has been humbled by the market and the prospect of economic adversities in the United States. So Mr. Big Bully isn't actually doing quite as well as Mr. Big Bully would like to claim he is.
In 1979, former chair of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, drove up interest rates to a staggering 17% in a bid to tackle inflation. Now, that was a terrible mess until it wasn't, and he became something of a financial folk hero a few years later. There are those arguing that Trump's chutzpah could turn the US economy around in a similar fashion. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'm not an economist. I don't want to predict how the economy will go. If it should happen that way, there is a silver lining in every dark cloud, and this may turn out to be one of them. But the prospect that it will actually happen, I think at the moment really doesn't look very good. And we also have to bear in mind, and this reflects my personal bias as a political scientist, that the wider prices that is being incurred by Trump, even if it brings some economic benefits to the United States in the longer term, the political damages to the standing of the United States, to the reputation, to the soft power, and to the capacity of the United States to mobilize allies to support the US, even sometimes in history on policies that were misguided, poorly judged, and poorly based, like the invasion of Iraq, will become history. It will become much more difficult to do that. And I am skeptical that whatever positive economic outcome there may be can compensate the wider prices that the United States has already incurred as a result of Trump's personal ambitions in the last 10 days or so.
A lot of his actions are already starting to cause dissent among certain members of the Republican Party, and certainly amongst the DC establishment, amongst government. Now, I'm in DC at the moment, and it's very interesting being here. You see people talking about decisions being made completely whimsically, influence being about proximity to Trump, proximity to the king almost. DC has become a kind of court. Do you have any idea what, as a political scientist, his advisors might be telling him? And as a political scientist, what would you be advising him to do?
I think the first thing we always notice in politics is that politics is ultimately about what is in your best interest in the short term. Republican politicians have willingly worked with and supported Trump because they thought that would be beneficial to their electoral fortune. If it is looking that Trump is wrecking the US economy and therefore turning voters for Republican senators and congressmen against them in the forthcoming midterm elections, I think we are going to see some Republicans, congressmen, and senators deciding that siding with Trump might be not so smart a move any longer, and in which case I think they will switch side. They will want to project that they are looking after their constituencies' interests, because if they don't, that will be the end of their political career.
Can I just follow up on that? Because I find this really interesting. What has really, really struck me is the lack of opposition to Donald Trump. And I'm told over and over again that Republican senators are just afraid. A bad tweet from Donald Trump can end them. He can primary them. They'll end up without any influence. But you now see the possibility of resistance despite this.
Well, I saw that more clearly yesterday until the evening, before Donald Trump retreated from his general tariff, because that was clearly leading the United States towards a recession. And the question really until evening yesterday, whether it will be a recession or whether it will be a depression. Now, with the Trump administration stepping back a bit, the scale of economic challenges would be reduced. And the rift between Trump and his billionaire donors, including Elon Musk, may become more manageable. And part of the power of Trump was he has secured the strong support of somebody like Elon Musk, who has demonstrated that he is willing and able to put enormous financial power behind politicians or against politicians. And with American elections so dependent on funding, that has some real teeth to the Trumpian threat that are being put against Republican politicians when they have to consider which way they go. Now, I don't think Republican politicians are all spineless. They are just very calculating politicians working out what would work best for them. And that calculus is changing all the time because Donald Trump is so unpredictable. And his relationship with people like Musk and other billionaires are changing. Which way it will go in the next 2 months, we don't know.
It's argued that the roots of Trump's desire to get even with China run very deep, back to his disgust at the country being allowed to join the World Trade Organization in 2001, and the hollowing out of American manufacturing that marked the era of globalization. Is there any truth to this, in your opinion? Is so much of this just personal spite?
I think it is more personal spite than anything else. I mean, arguably, one could say that the United States had helped China to modernize and become that industrial superpower which it is today. I think there is a lot of elements of truth there. But that wasn't being done to simply help China. It was being done because it was mutually beneficial. It was beneficial to the United States as well, with a different kind of calculus. The calculation might have been not so smartly based, but it was a rational calculation in the 90s, noughties, and the teens for the US to benefit from that globalization and the establishment of a very efficient and effective global supply chain, with China doing all those dirty manufacturings that US citizens were not wanting to deliver any longer. And it helped people's living standards, not only in China and in the United States, across the world. We all benefited from that globalization process. So now suddenly to simply say that all that was negative is a bit of a rewriting of history, not entirely respecting what in fact happened in history.
Thanks to my guests today, Edward Alden and Professor Steve Sang, and to you for listening. Join me, David Patrikarakos, next time as we continue to bring you dispatches from a world on the brink. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram at Apocalypse Now Pod, and you can get in touch via email at apocalypsenowpod@dailymail.com. We'll see you again next week as we ask once again, Apocalypse Now?